Hello, everyone, and welcome back for some exciting new content. We are on the second episode of the Authentic Wellness series, in which we're going to talk about ACE scores, what it is, how they came about, how is this so very much related to CPTSD. If this is your first time listening, I do want to throw in that listener's discretion is advised, that what we will be covering may be triggering to some listeners. I understand that the subject I am focusing on is very taboo. I recognize this topic is uncomfortable and may cause some unwanted feelings for some listeners. If you feel that this discussion is too much, please take a step away. There is no harm in that, there's nothing wrong with vulnerability and hard emotion. As we kicked off the last episode, I gave an overview of what CPTSD is by finding and explaining the general components. Like I mentioned, this whole series will be focused on topics relative to CPTSD that are commonly found and taken from psychology and the field of medicine. And this, after all, is authentic wellness, where we strive to be authentically well. By that, I mean we embrace life in ways that feel comfortable for ourselves, promoting the presence of our best selves. The first lecture in psychology that I ever heard happened to be on this topic that we're talking about today, the ACE score. Being someone that can never listen, I was never able to pay attention to absolutely anyone on stage besides myself. I found it weird that I was captivated by every form of knowledge that was delivered in this message. The message was about ACE scores. I was a freshman in college. Before I say anything else about this, I want to begin by defining what an ACE score is. What does that stand for? It stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences or Adverse Childhood Events. I find that the more talks I hear about this topic, there is a general trend on how people choose to begin explaining what the ACE score is. I've seen that they usually start the conversation with listing statistics that provide a direct correlation between a declining health issue and a number on the ACE score scale. And I feel that may confuse most people, but more than that, scare some people into not wanting to hear more about this topic because it hits very personally sometimes. And that is not what I want to do here. I'm going to start from the most basic thing, defining adverse childhood experiences. So ACEs are traumatic. And I keep that in quotations because everyone interprets things differently, and some things are seen more traumatic than others for some people. So generally, these are events that occur before the child reaches the age of 18, before the child is an adult. These events can be types of abuse, neglect, or they can be situational. There was a huge study conducted in the mid-1990s that theorized that there is a very high correlation between negative health outcomes in adulthood with the more adversity the individual faced before the age of 18. The study is due to a partnership between the Center for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente. The purpose was to study the relationship between adult health risk behavior and child abuse or household dysfunction. The study was conducted at 2 times, with 2 sets of data. The first beginning around 1994, with about 9,000 individuals. The study was nothing more than a 10-question questionnaire that was mailed to all these people. How the scores were calculated, as mentioned in the questionnaire, it had 10 questions, and they were each yes or no questions. The individual will answer all of them with a yes or a no, and for each yes, that person would be given 1 point. In the first set of data that was acquired, there was a 70.5% response rate. After the very first day, they quickly found that there was an increased risk for drug usage, a greater likelihood of sexually transmitted disease, and challenges with physical activity with those who scored a higher number on the questionnaire. On to the following sample. They had about 17,000 participants this time. The additional findings came across with an increased risk of heart, lung, and liver disease, multiple types of cancer that correlated with a higher score. To go into more detail, apart from this questionnaire, the participants were given a family health history and health appraisal questionnaire to further assess their findings and link patterns between health disparities and adversities. These questionnaires asked a lot for the sake of greater understanding. I want to go over the 10 questions right now. So basically, the first time I was introduced to this concept of an ACE score, I was given this questionnaire myself. As broad as these questions may seem, they do have a purpose. But it is super important to acknowledge that the ACE score questionnaire is not a diagnostic tool, nor does it predict any individual risk of a client. All these questions are yes or no. For how many yes, that is your ACE score. The first question here is asking if a parent or adult in your household ever swore at you, put you down, or humiliated you, or acted in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt. You would answer yes or no, and then move on to the second question. Did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw things at you? Did they ever hit you so hard that you had marks? Question 3. Has an adult or person at least 5 years or older than you ever touched you, or have you touched their body in a sexual way? Question number 4. Do you often feel that nobody in your family loved you, thought you were important or special? Did your family look out for each other, feel close, or was there no support? Did you often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, that you had dirty clothes, or your parents were too high or drunk to take you to the doctor? Number 6. Did your parents ever separate or divorce? Number 7. Was your mother, stepmother often pushed, grabbed, or thrown things, hit repeatedly or threatened with a gun or knife or a fist, etc.? Number 8. Did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker, alcoholic, or on street drugs? Number 9. Was a household member depressed, mentally ill, or did they attempt suicide? And number 10. Did a household member ever go to prison? Literally, after filling this out, everyone in the class was like, what was yours? What was yours? I had heard things along the lines of 1, 2, 3. One girl had 4. You want to know what I had? 8. You best better believe that was the beginning of me questioning so much about myself. Little did I know what the next 2 years would consist of. In the study, 17,000 participants were surveyed and asked about experiences they had in childhood related to family dysfunction, abuse, neglect, and situational events that may have been traumatic for them. These questions were then to be compared to their current health status and behaviors. Around this time is when we begin to see that there had been an ongoing speculation and theories leaning towards the link between childhood trauma and chronic disease and issues in adulthood. As you guys can already assume, the theory goes that you had a greater likelihood of negative outcomes in adulthood related to health, social situations, and overall quality of life if your ACE score was higher. After this original study, 30% of people said they had about 0 ACEs, 48.4% of people said they had about 1 to 3, and then 21% of people said they had 4 or more. In the mid-1990s, people were just starting to question a connection between one's upbringing and their long-term success or their way of life. They began to question that one's upbringing would affect their life long term. And from then on, we would slowly start to make the connection between how much trauma was affecting society. It's the fact that these questions seem very broad, but became so personal to people, it changed the whole perspective on how common these situations were. What does this study basically do? It took 10 types of adversities and divided them up into 3 categories. Thus, this is where the questions come from. What the first set of questions talk about is household dysfunction, such as substance abuse, parental separation or divorce, mental illness, and battered mothers, criminal behavior, and then it moves on to abuse, emotional, physical, and sexual. And then we have the questions on the physical and emotional state. ACE scores are everywhere. But as broad and as similar as the questions come about every time, people never have the same. But as broad and as similar these questions seem, people who may have the same score, it never means that they have the same level of biological stress. I go back to the quotation marks around the word traumatic. Various experiences were viewed differently by children as they grow up, some more intense and some less intense. We all take our environment very differently. We absorb things very differently and react differently to events going on around us due to different factors. That is just how humans work and how they absorb their life experiences. So much goes into play that 100 different people with an ACE score of 4 can have completely different results from that. More so, how a person with a score of 3 can have more significant health consequences than someone with a score of 5. It all depends on how the person took in that trauma, how the person took in the event, and how did it affect that child. Why did it affect that child more than the other one? But what the scores did was highlight the effects and consequences of adversity. These are invisible issues that almost everyone faces. These scores, being so common, is leading to one of the greatest epidemics in health. We live in a society where mental illness, addiction, homelessness, health disparities, early death runs rampant, where dysfunctional families, domestic violence, suicide, crime rates, and chronic illness are an all-time high. ACE statistics and studies show exponential growth in these areas. I have not heard the ACE score concept explained better than the way Nadine Burke Harris explains it. She has a TED Talk titled How Childhood Trauma Affects Health Across the Lifetime. The first time I heard this lecture, I was blown away. She talks about the concept that is so common, but gets so hidden in our society by health professionals and expert specialists. They were ignorant on the idea that adversity could affect children so dramatically. She is the author of The Deepest Well, published in 2018, about toxic childhood stress. She is an icon as she advocates for a better understanding of one of the most serious health epidemics, that is childhood trauma. Using her education to start a clinic in one of San Francisco's most underserved communities, she took the research from the CDC and Kaiser study to identify ACEs as a major risk factor for why children in this community had so many underlying health issues, so prevalent and so early. She noticed an abnormal trend in the early onset of disease in children as young as 4 years old, based on asking families questions about their child's exposure to adverse events, their upbringing, and their experienced trauma. As a pediatrician, she began to raise public awareness for how professionals in society can pay more attention to this issue. She went on and founded the Center for Youth Wellness in order to advance research on toxic stress and what solutions can be brought to address this. Drawing in research from the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, Dr. Burke Harris identified adverse childhood experiences as a major risk factor affecting the health of her patients. In 2011, she founded the Center for Youth Wellness and subsequently grew the organization to be a national leader in the effort to advance pediatric medicine, to raise public awareness and transform the way society responds to children exposed to ACEs and toxic stress. She founded and led the Bay Area Research Consortium on Toxic Stress and Health to advance scientific screening and treatment of toxic stress. Back when I was at Liberty University for my freshman year of college in my social work program, they required us to attend 5 seminars per semester. They would have the seminars on different topics of social sciences. I think it was the second seminar I had ever gone to, and it was a lecture on scores and trauma, something I had not really learned much about at the time, but I knew existed, and I knew it could have potentially been interesting. I think it's funny how ignorant I was at the fact that in the back of my mind, you had gone through some stuff, but none of it at the time seemed to be worth to label it as traumatic. At the time, I was still so much focused in putting all my energy on my future, because to me, the past was something that was non-existent. I had nothing to fall back on, so at 18, 19, I was still in the mindset of, well, nothing has worked in my favor ever, so let's just focus really hard on my career and sort of put a big black sheet over my childhood, my upbringing, my previous education, and simply forget it exists. It's not something I wanted to claim as part of my identity. I didn't want to define it because it was full of shame. So for the first semester of college, it was all lies about what I did and who I was, and believe me, this lecture humbled me to an extent because I was forced to be in a room where people could potentially see my vulnerability. At that time, I thought I was taking a 10-question personality quiz. I didn't understand why my score was so high. At the end of the lecture, they gave us the actual questionnaire and told us to take it, to fold our paper in half when we were done. I thought it was excessive. As I took it, I wondered if I was second-guessing myself. Did these things really happen to me? Should I lie right now? I feel like I had almost every yes on the page, but it's also embarrassing because I don't want to admit this. I don't want to admit that it happened to me. But I'm going to be truthful on this, even though I myself don't believe that my yeses to these questions are true yeses. I told myself that I may be exaggerating. That's what I felt at the time. Literally, once it was over, I tried to redo it, sitting next to my friend, and she had a score of 2. And even questioning herself about doing 2 when she generally thought she had 1. I definitely felt like I had filled it out wrong. And me overhearing everyone share their scores, it took me a couple weeks before I could stop thinking about the questionnaire and asking myself, was my number so high because in that moment all my repressed trauma was deep in hiding? I was very unaware of it, but I do remember not being the same from that day because the 8 didn't make sense. I tried to take the questionnaire again and I kept gaslighting myself into possibly giving myself another number, but my gut was telling me that I had 8 yeses. We only had 2 no's, so that's something to pay attention to. I think the hardest part was possibly acknowledging that some of those health statistics could pertain to me. But on the other hand, at the time I was perfectly healthy as I've ever been actually. So how could statistics of a score of 8 be my reality? And it wasn't until my trauma resurfaced that very next year that I understood ACE scores on another level. It was a concept that brought me a lot of comfort to why things were happening to me in 2020 that I never had experienced before. As much as a painful realization ACE scores can be, for some people, the concept is essential. I think the medical profession, especially the mental health field, would be incredibly behind if ACE scores were never a thing. Because when we look at most of our patients nowadays, getting an intake exam, one of the main things we ask them is to tell us their history, to tell us about events in their lives and how they impacted them significantly. And that brings us to the positives of the ACE score. It's going to help us identify where we're at. Everyone has a different walk of life and everyone comes from different backgrounds and different histories, so much so as we seem to be on the same path, but we are very much on a different one than those who are doing the exact same thing as us currently. There's a lot we can do. There's also a lot medical professionals can do if they get a general idea of where the person is at. Based on the ACE score, begin to take steps to precaution to avoid further decline in health. Because ACEs are essential, they give us a way to find the origin of a problem. They give us a direction to identify the root of an issue. ACE score study essentially showed thousands of professionals how much adversity can pile up and how great the effect can be the more that people go through. I heard it growing up in the early 2000s. Thousands of times the traumatic events are essentially there to make you stronger, tougher, and more resilient. It was a positive thing as people determined that something traumatic happened to you, like you grew up in poverty or that you went hungry or that you witnessed some sort of violence. Then they try to shift it as an event that was there for your own benefit. And that's essentially how I grew up thinking about my trauma. My early childhood experiences were there to make me really resilient and really strong. A really strong woman one day. But all of it was a lie when it came to my early 20s, when everything just plummeted and I became very sick because my body just couldn't take it anymore. I was holding all that in. Every number that a person identifies with, that's what they've been holding on for so long. No wonder there are health disparities piling up on top of each other. Disease, chronic illness. There have been so many diagnoses in our society because these numbers add up and they stay. They don't leave once you experience them. Trauma does not go away, and that's just a sad reality of what we live in and the consequences of generational trauma and mistreatment of others. It's just where we're at. But if the score is able to serve as a tool with biological measures, then it is something so necessary. It's able to take common data and find a common trend between chronic illness, so it's going to demonstrate where our bodies are at, a result of what has happened to us over time. It's going to provide preventative care across different generations from now on. It's the ACE scores that were able to address the effects of toxic stress and attribute that to epigenetics, which is essentially what genes get passed on through generation and how the body is going to express it. How the body is going to decide what genes it uses and what it doesn't. It's going to determine how our bodies react in distress and how people in our family react due to stress. We're going to act in a similar way due to epigenetics. Similarly, a traumatic event that may have affected a loved one in a previous generation may also affect you, given that you cannot experience the same event, but that trauma leaves a lasting imprint on the blueprint that is your DNA composition. So even if we are aware that we are at risk for certain health diseases based upon our understanding our toxic stress or the toxic stress of a loved one, we can do so much more to prevent the disease from getting worse or even taking effect. I'm also super big on being able to understand another person's perspective and how people are the way they are. And I think the ACE score tells us so much about what that person has gone through, what that person is currently facing. We can learn about others and take into consideration that trauma has affected this person, and this person may struggle with some things, such as emotional dysregulation, holding a job, managing relationships. In all its core, it's another reason to have grace towards one another. And if we were to discuss some negatives, which unfortunately comes with every study, one of the unfortunate areas that this study is lacking is the specifics on events that occurred which impacted us so hard as children. An ACE score can never tell you the frequency of an event, how intense the event was for you, how chronic the situation was. When it came to living this through the eyes of a child, there's no way of knowing that as of right now. Though, through the platform, through the score that you have, it's already an opportunity so you can do individual research. I can take some time to reflect, to self-reflect, and understand why the score is a score, but essentially there is no way of knowing how badly it affected you because each person is so different. But then again, not being on the same level of biological stress does not invalidate what we experienced. I cannot use a score to diagnose mental illness or disease. We can use it as a guiding tool towards pointing us in the right direction on what we need to pay attention to. It allows us to look at what we are doing in the present or what situations we are in the present and how we can eliminate the occurrence or the reoccurrence of toxic stress in our lives to improve our outcomes in the future. Have a better reassurance that we can achieve a healthier state or we can remain healthy as we are today. On a more personal level, I didn't want to ride over this. It's the idea of finding your score. It felt like a slap in the face because it definitely did for me. It can definitely be upsetting for those who have a higher score in comparison with siblings or other family members or friends, close relatives who have a lower score. They're probably wondering what went wrong. Were they too sensitive? Were they absorbing the event more than they should have, calling themselves dramatic or weak? But more than that, it brings about the single hardest emotion from having trauma, from having PTSD, and that is the hopelessness that people feel, especially when people see those statistics who wouldn't feel helpless, being given a percentage of their lifespan, being told that early death is still likely for them based on the ACE score of 5. And then the fact that we can become upset at the scores of others for either being way lower or way higher. This allows us to take a look over interpersonal relationships. One major one that I've observed is the parent becoming deeply upset with themselves knowing that their child's score is particularly high. Really, this is something that Nadine Burke has observed in her practice because she would interview these parents and ask them questions about their children. And upon hearing about the score of the child, the parents will become very upset. I think there's a notion for self-blame and guilt for having to put a child through that. And then there's parents who are unaware that their child has been put through that. So the ACE score is going to bring a new form of thinking, and it opens the minds of professionals to hopefully ask themselves, how serious are we going to take adverse childhood experiences? Because that's a dictator of many things. I remember growing up and going to doctors and never once being asked about my life at home. But I do know now that they're implementing screenings to parents and parents of children and asking these important questions. They're asking how the child is doing at home, how they're doing socially, and they're talking to the child and taking into account their experiences. They're listening to what happened at home or what happened when their parents were away. These are important questions that doctors need to be asking. It is unrealistic that the screening is going to prevent all child abuse, but more of it does need to be done. We can become upset at the scores of others for either being way lower or way higher. What really disturbed me the most about the whole ACE score concept were the statistics on the StopAbuseCampaign.org site. It listed several ones that I'm going to read right now and provide other resources on how they got the statistics, what measures were taken, and a bunch of other ones, which can be extremely disturbing, but it's a reality and it's something we have to address and we have to know, especially if we're working in the field of mental health and health in general. I'm just going to read some of these off. It says across the 50 states, 50% of children's ACE scores are acquired by the age of 3. That one is astounding to me, that the exposure of violence and neglect in the environment that a child is literally born into is the reason they have an ACE score already by the age of 3. That's before they even enter school. That's insane to me, if left untreated. So if children do not receive support, guidance throughout their development, children with high ACE scores face a 20-year decrease in life expectancy. So that's going to cut off 20 years of your life based on the trauma that you have faced, that your body is holding. And all that can be definitely due to chronic health, but it can also be more of a mental health component that they are going to struggle with daily functioning as a result of never having any form of help or assistance to recover and heal. If we talk about the topic of alcoholism in our society, guys, children who experience 4 or more ACEs are 7.4 times more likely to suffer from alcoholism and 12.2 times more likely to attempt suicide. And that's just heartbreaking. And children who experience 2 or more ACEs are nearly 3 times more likely to repeat a grade. Definitely been there. They are separated by categories. So under criminal justice, they state that juvenile offenders are 4 times more likely to have experienced 4 or more ACEs than those in the CDC Kaiser study. Like, I don't think we're even aware of how much ACEs are costing our society. 40.1 billion is what the epidemic is costing us in our country. 401 billion. And those sums are from the healthcare, child welfare, criminal justice costs, and the cost of long-term effects of child abuse. So specifically, how do ACE scores impact trauma-informed care? They are at the core of everything in regards to the direction we take in healing from childhood trauma. A major part of healing is very much physical. As I mentioned, my view on this is that the body has endured so much that we know a general idea of what can potentially be at risk for it. This is an opportunity to open our eyes to new areas of care that we weren't paying attention to, that we didn't think we had access to, or we didn't look into getting help for. And I know that sounds easier said than done because people with a history of trauma struggle on so many levels, and the main one being access to resources and having a support system to rely on. So my proposition on this is the use of a connection that the ACE score study provided to help yourself as much as possible. I want you, regardless of how high your ACE score is, to acknowledge that despite that number, you are still here. I want it no longer to be a perspective on what doesn't kill me made me stronger. No, it definitely gave you character, but what didn't kill you is a reason that you should keep going. And as cliche as that sounds, everything you have done that has gotten you to where you are today is because of your hard work and effort back then. Your younger self was able to do that with all that they had, with what they had. With the lack of support, safety, and guidance, you used what you had to push yourself out of your situation, to help you survive so that you can sit here today and be proud of the younger you that fought so hard to get you here despite all that they had to shut out, all that they had to put up with. It is not your fault that you didn't do enough, because truth is you did the absolute most you could with what you had. And look at all you've accomplished. Even if it's just being alive, even if it's just managing a job, getting a degree. As tired and physically unwell that you may feel now, I want to encourage you to keep working hard for yourself, because younger you fought for you, fought for your survival, for your success, and you made it. You did that. You're here. And life is so precious that a score cannot define your ability to succeed. A score cannot get in the way of your hopes and dreams. The score is only a tool to help you target areas where you need to pay special attention to, where you need to recognize that you need to help yourself out as you have always been doing. The only difference now is that you are safe. You are independent and you are able to make choices for yourself that feel right, comfortable, and consensual. I have an ACE score of 8, as I mentioned. I used to look at it and immediately start second guessing myself because I didn't want the 8 to define me. I didn't at the time want to accept that what did happen to me actually happened to me. That 8 was a denial. That 8 to me represented an infinity sign, that I would always be stuck living in my past, dealing with my past because my score is so high. And on one part, yes, when you have complex trauma, there are parts of your past that you cannot separate yourself from because such intense events took place. And that is the life we got, the cards we were dealt, but that's just half of the story. I can take my ACE score of 8, make it into 8 more reasons to keep living, to make it into 8 more ways that I can help myself physically and mentally recover from years of abuse and neglect. I am 23 years old and I am beyond capable of transitioning into a reality that I adore and that is mine only, not anyone else's, because I get to start living for myself. And what a blessing it is to realize my 8 so early at the age of 20 than so late. I think ACE scores really created a breakthrough towards trauma-informed care for one of two reasons. It provides such data, which confirmed a theory many didn't really want to put out or admit that it was true. So when a numerical data comes into the picture, I think it becomes more accessible for more warranted research and for acknowledgement by many people. Especially when it's simple data, such as a number between 1 and 10, it's easy to see. It may be difficult to understand it on an overall level. See that almost every group you interact with, there are people who have ACEs and who have similar ACE experiences given that they are so different, thus allowing for inclusion in the CPTSD community. Secondly, the trauma-focused treatment programs and therapies have been reconstructed or altered to meet more deep-rooted needs within trauma survivors, rather than just skimming the surface of their pain or just the symptoms of depression. A few treatments like EMDR, intensive outpatient, and mindfulness-based stress reduction now acknowledge the ACE score as an asset for treatment to see, hey, this person has an ACE score of 6. They are at a really high risk for these behaviors. Let me talk to the client about behavioral patterns in their life and address issues that they have noticed about themselves, and also provide in-depth knowledge and awareness to other risk factors, just to be made aware of certain things that may prevent them from being their best self. Let's target main issues that they present to us, and let us also educate, because authenticity comes with being very, very self-aware of who you are and what you know to be true based on what happened to you. It's a startup for power. That's why I always talk about the badass side of grown-ups with PTSD. It's that they know themselves on a whole different level. It's almost like we have this whole different raw perspective of the world. And if we use that to give us power, we're unstoppable because we know how fragmented life can be, but also how beautiful it can be to literally breathe in resilience. And I want to close out with this little segment. Most of us who have complex trauma have usually come to the realization or have experienced the I am hopeless era, where we see what we went through, what we have to endure, and sort of see it as a reason why we don't deserve the things we have now, or that we simply have no future or ability to succeed anymore based on what happened to us. We sit in our dark aroma and grieve what we did not have, and that was essentially enough, and that as every child becoming an adult needs a lot of needs met at specific areas of development. And a lot of survivors of trauma, frankly, lack them. The ACE score is just a horrifically broad summary. If you had to put a summary on all types of common trauma into ChatGPT and hit summarize it, it would come out with the ACE score quiz. Because as much as the quiz didn't target all trauma, it covered enough that there was a majority consensus that adverse childhood experiences can become a health epidemic. And they are a health epidemic today. Within the healthcare system, there is a lot of attention paid to health epidemics, just like we did with COVID-19. What drives our society to fight the end of a health crisis? It's grief. It's the lack of resources that so many people had to deal with. It's a scarcity of support and the inability to escape our circumstances. And if we look at the advancements that resulted from the pandemic, we see that despite the loss, there was so much gain in the medical field to find cures, to find immunity for the disease, to implement lifestyle changes, to avoid contracting the virus. Same goes for the world's biggest health epidemic being trauma. So let's not sit and wallow in hopelessness, but let's seek out those resources for our younger selves and give them a promising, hopeful, healthy future, since they didn't get to have that. If you want to learn more about the ACE scores in general, the study and post studies that have been conducted by professionals working towards improving trauma-informed care, I have attached all the links where I have acquired my information, learn about ACEs, and derived my data from. This is such a cool topic for you guys, and it has changed how I view trauma by populations. This is such a cool topic. It changed the way how I view trauma experienced by different population groups and a society as a whole. So I highly encourage you guys to keep looking into this, to keep advocating for more awareness on this great health epidemic. So until next time, when we're going to be taking a deep dive into my past and talking about my education journey, how I got here, how in the hell my schooling went, this episode is by far one of my absolute favorites, so you won't want to miss this. Let's strive to be authentically well.